Nicolas Langlitz is an anthropologist and historian of science. There he is, wonderful. And he specializes in ethnographic fieldwork as the basis for philosophical inquiry. Also, he's associate professor and chair of anthropology at the New School for Social Work in New York. Among his publications are Die Zeit der Psychoanalyse, Lacan und das Problem der Sitzungsdauer, Neuropsychedelia, the revival of hallucinogen research since the decade of the brain, and his forthcoming publication is actually scheduled for next Tuesday, titled Chimpanzee Culture Wars, Rethinking Human Nature Alongside Japanese, European, and American Cultural Primatologists. There it is for all to see. Now, among his many interests are the complex and often contradictory entanglements of the human conditions, and as such are moralistic predicaments. Fittingly, in today's talk, he will tackle the paradoxical place of psychedelic humanities in consciousness of culture, or culture consciousness, sorry. So, as the hypothesis goes, the aim of humanities scholarship is to validate contradictory and diversified epistemology, while the psychedelic experience, however, is generally conceived of as inherently unifying. Now, how do we resolve this predicament? Ladies and gentlemen, a warm welcome to Nicolas Langlitz.
Okay, so thanks to the Mind Foundation and especially to Henrik for inviting me to give this talk. I would like to talk about the paradoxical place of the psychedelic humanities in consciousness culture. And as has been pointed out before, the idea of the consciousness culture was developed by Thomas Metzinger in the 1990s and 2000s. He argued that the humanities should accompany an ongoing scientific revolution in the life sciences. And as you probably know, Metzinger's main interest is in the neurosciences and in cognitive science. He argued that they were generating a radically new naturalist image of the human and enabled new capacities to intervene into human life, for example, through neurotechnologies or through psychopharmacological means. And that would lead to a break with traditional anthropologies. These scientific advances should be integrated into society by developing a scientifically informed consciousness culture. This consciousness culture had two important components. The first one is that technology assessments of those new interventions had to be complemented by what he called an anthropology assessment of the risks and consequences of new images of the human. And he also advocated a consciousness ethics, which is not like a lot of traditional ethics about what to do and what not to do, but about the evaluation of different states of consciousness. So inner, purely subjective states, such as psychedelic experiences. In my 2012 book, Neuropsychedelia, the revival of hallucinogen research since the decade of the brain, I took up this concept of an anthropology assessment in the last chapter. And I did that not by way of bioethical speculation. You know the genre of imagine we had a pill that would allow us to do something that no actual drug can ever accomplish. But by way of ethnographic observation of people who already understood themselves in neuroscientific terms and who intervened in their lives through psychopharmacology. So an ethnographic study of hallucinogen researchers seemed to be an excellent case study because they think about themselves in terms of neuroscientific knowledge, being neuroscientists themselves, and they also have first-hand experience of their altered brain chemistry. So for them, the philosophical doctrine of mind-brain identity was not just the matter of thought experiments, but of self-experiments. I won't say much about the book. All I'm going to point out now is that so people in the laboratories that I studied, that is mostly Franz Vollenweider's lab in Zurich and Mark Geyer's lab in San Diego, did understand themselves as what the British sociologist Nicholas Rose called neurochemical selves. So they very much understood themselves in terms of their brain chemistry. But this was usually brought up in the form of joking about the comic ridiculousness of being one's brain. What I also found was that many of them shared what I dubbed mystic materialism. That is an outlook that was less invested in the drug-induced mystical experiences, which they also studied in the lab, but that primarily embraced a form of biomysticism that was in awe of life itself. So, you know, and it's the sort of the combination of mysticism and materialism is enabled by the fact that these are two forms of monism, right? They're both invested in some kind of understanding of oneness. And in the case of mystic materialism, it's really about being one with the material universe and taking some comfort from that. As to the anthropology assessment, I would say that this way of life was both ethnographically and philosophically very interesting, but I don't think that it had a utopian quality or that it was particularly alarming. So this was definitely not the stuff that the German Ethics Council would be concerned with. Now, you know, I think it's not surprising that this was less earth-shattering than some assumed, given that materialist images of the human have been around for a very long time. So you can find them in ancient Indian and ancient Greek philosophy. They were an important component of radical Enlightenment philosophies like La Maîtrise, L'Homme Machine. Or in the late 19th century, you have organizations like the Society of Mutual Autopsy in Paris, which you can see on the image, which was a group of physical anthropologists and physicians who would cut each other up and dissect each other's brains every time one of them had died, to prove to each other once again that there was no soul to be found in their brain. And psychedelics, of course, have also been around for a very long time, at least since antiquity. You know, in contrast to some of the expectations that built up in the course of the 1990s and early 2000s, I think we have not seen a boost for rational drug design in the wake of the decade of the brain. Neither in the realm of general psychopharmacology nor in the realm of psychedelic research. In fact, in the 2010s, we've even seen a pretty dramatic crisis of drug development and psychopharmacology, which led many big pharmaceutical companies to close down their psychopharmacology departments because they felt, you know, they had not produced any genuinely new substances in decades, actually. And they decided to move their financial resources elsewhere. I think this is one of the reasons why we currently have so much interest in psychedelic pharmacopsychotherapies. So, you know, I also believe that there have been important advances in the neurosciences and in neuropsychopharmacology since the 1990s, but I don't think that they have led to any philosophical and certainly not to any cultural revolution. So that is to say, if we look back at Thomas Metzinger's concept of the consciousness culture, which was coined 2 or 3 decades ago, you know, today my sense is that this very modernist narrative that assumed that the neurosciences were introducing some major historical break was overly optimistic or overly alarmist. You know, I mean, you can find both positive and negative evaluations in his work. The mystic materialism that I described for the psychedelic labs, and I think the same can be said about other psychedelic philosophies, is really a recombination of often old and sometimes very old philosophical elements with new scientific facts. And I think that argument could be generalized and applied to neurophilosophy as a whole. So I would argue for a non-modern concept of consciousness culture, which is less contingent on this assumption that we have this dramatic break that opens up an entirely new space in which we have to completely reinvent ourselves. That said, I totally agree with Thomas Metzinger that the humanities should aim at a rational integration of new empirical findings, whether they are revolutionary or not. Ethnographic observation of the philosophical field, however, suggests that such integration has not really entailed the elimination of many philosophical positions. So, if you read Patricia Churchland's work from the mid-1980s, and I think Metzinger's work has followed to some extent in her footsteps there, she advocated this eliminative materialism, where any philosophical concept or theory that would not be in line with the neurosciences would ultimately be eliminated. So this has been more prescriptive than an accurate descriptive account of philosophy. We still see many of the positions in philosophy that we already saw in ancient philosophy. So we still have materialists fighting it out with Platonists, monists opposing dualists, realists arguing with skeptics, and so on. So philosophy has remained persistently pluralist. And I would argue that multiple rationalizations of the given scientific findings are possible and maintain this pluralism even in the context of a consciousness culture as a project of rationalization. So any form of life can be rationalized, even the pursuit of irrational goals. That's one thing we have learned from Max Weber's work on the Protestant ethic. Rationalization, at least in the sociological sense, means that you mobilize means to pursue a given end. And obviously science can help with that a great deal because it tells you something about means-ends relationships. What is important is that this work is pursued in a systematic fashion, not in an ad hoc fashion. And that requires a persistent work on the self to turn yourself into somebody who is consistent in this way. So, if you understand that pain is an undesirable state of mind, and we're causing animals pain, then you should become a vegetarian, and you should not just, not order the steak once in a restaurant, but you should basically do it for the rest of your life, and so on. So this kind of work on the self is what Weber meant by rationalization. But what Weber also realized was that rationalization is itself irrational. So his example for this was capitalism as a rationalization of the economy, which eventually pursued a rather irrational goal, which is, people begin to serve money rather than money serving people. And Weber was very aware that, this is, even from a hedonistic point of view, this is an irrational way of life, but it is pursued in a highly rationalized manner. So like Metzinger, Weber was no moral realist. He did not believe that there were objective moral values that we just have to find out, which eventually, at least in Weber's version of it, means that all values or ends are really irrational. So that puts a limit to the rationalization of consciousness cultures as well. That also means that different philosophies can inform different rationalizations and thus different consciousness cultures. So consciousness culture is, at least in my perspective, is always something that should come in the plural. It's not a singular thing. Regarding the role of the humanities in consciousness culture, I found Georgi Marcus's essay, Why is there no hermeneutics of the natural sciences, from 1987, very helpful. Marcus distinguishes the humanities from the natural sciences mostly based on research, citation analysis research in the sociology of science, which shows that the citation patterns that you see in scientific papers usually cover about 1 to 50 years. Most of the citations are of very recent research. And then there are a couple of seminal papers that can be about 50 years old. And that's about it in terms of their historical memory. By contrast, the humanities have a citation span that goes back up to 2,500 years. And that is because in addition to current research and seminal research, they also cite the classics. And Marcus argued that the classics function in humanist discourse is to organize polemics. So they give the humanities what he described as their polemic dissensive structure, that distinguishes them from the sciences, which revolve more around the formation of consensus and cooperation between researchers. Of course, that's an account of what Thomas Kuhn called normal science, not of scientific revolutions, where obviously there is a lot of upheaval. I would argue Thomas Metzinger's analytic philosophy, the kind of analytic philosophy of mind that he has been pursuing is largely modeled on the sciences, but it also contains a lot of implicit and explicit references to classics and polemic positionings. So you take his naturalism in opposition to the phenomenology of the life world, or if you take his neuroscientific approach to consciousness culture, you could interpret it as being in a polemic opposition to the Frankfurt School's opposition to the philosophy of consciousness and to biologism. And I think, given that he came of age in the Frankfurt philosophy department, I think biographically his polemics against them have been quite significant, even though he doesn't really write about them. Okay, so let me slowly come to an end by talking about the paradox of the psychedelic humanities. So I want to highlight two paradoxes. The first one is an ethical paradox. The psychedelic humanities, as I understand them, are humanities that accompany advances in neuropsychopharmacology of psychedelics. Of course, they could also be about other things, such as psychedelic literature or the social scientific literature on hallucinogen use and so on. And then we have two components. It's psychedelic and humanities. So the term psychedelic was coined in an exchange between the psychiatrist Humphrey Osmond and the British writer Aldous Huxley. And Huxley took it to mean mind manifesting. It's about the manifestation of a cosmic mind at large in the individual human mind. So that amounts to a mystical experience of oneness. And this sense of oneness extends to others. It's the experience that all is in all and that all is actually each. So this kind of unitive experience is highly valued. On the other hand, we have Georgi Marcus's conception of the humanities as being articulated in a polemic dissensive way. So there you have the ethical paradox that you know, the psychedelic humanities would have to be simultaneously unitive and dissensive. And then the question is, what are we to make of this paradox? How are we going to resolve it? So I think, you know, this question in itself is a question for humanities scholarship. There is no scientific answer to that. Richard Rorty argued that when we know what we want, but we don't know how to get it, we look to the natural sciences for help, but we look to the humanities and arts when we are not sure what we should want. And I think that that's the kind of question we have here. And, you know, of course, in the discussion, we should also talk about a couple of critical empirical questions that could be asked about my account of this, which is, you know, is Huxley's phenomenology accurate and comprehensive? And is Marcus' sociology of science actually accurate? Right? So that maybe that will help to resolve the paradox. The second paradox is an epistemological one, which was already pointed out by Thomas Metzinger himself, which is that a state of complete self-annihilation, of total ego dissolution, is not observable because no one would be left to introspect. In the context of a 5-MeO-DMT self-experiment, the underground drug chemist Sasha Shulgin described this state as a whiteout in comparison to with a blackout. So psychedelic humanities are about knowledge and they are about valuations. So they should not evoke an intellectual whiteout in their audience, but they should provide distinct perspectives. But observation, conceptualization, evaluation, and so on, they all require telling things apart in one way rather than another. So then the question is how to communicate about an inobservable, unexperienceable experience of oneness. So to conclude, the problem is this. Unitive experience is at the center of the psychedelic humanities, but can't be translated into an ethical or epistemic structure for humanist scholarship. Any unitive position is bound to be contentious. If you want to look at an example, just read Adorno's attack on Huxley's perennial philosophy as being inherently conservative. So the paradox of the psychedelic humanities is this. If psychedelic humanities were unitive, they couldn't assert a contentious position and would fail to clarify through differentiation. If they asserted a contentious position and clarified through differentiation, they couldn't be unitive. You know, I think there would be two possible resolutions, and I'm sure you can think of more later on. The first one is you drop out of the humanities and contemplate mystical oneness and silence. And the second one is you pursue the humanities as a form of second-order observation. That means you observe how other observers observe the world rather than observing you know, yourself, what the world is like. And then you see that psychedelic mysticism represents one polemic position among many possible psychedelic philosophies. So the second order observer does not strongly identify with or advocate for one particular position. So this could either take the form of you know, genuinely detached observation, maybe what Weber would have described as value freedom, or a form of experimental adoption of changing positions. And I would argue that such second order observation is not just a knowledge practice, but it's a spiritual exercise in its own right. And in that respect, it could also become part of a consciousness culture informed by psychedelic humanities. And then of course the question is, you know, shouldn't this kind of way of understanding you know, at least a subset of the human condition get its own kind of anthropology assessment. But, you know, then we end up with a new paradox because that's still a position of no position. And that is bound to be contentious in the humanities again. So I think at the end of the day, we can't really escape paradoxes. All we can do is we can pick a paradox, one that we would like to live by, at least for now. Thank you.